Today's video is sponsored by Reedsy. The middle of your story can become a wasteland of meandering plots, uninteresting filler, and half-finished subplots. Nothing is worse than a soggy middle, regardless of if you are the writer or the intended audience. I've worked with many writers who have stated that this part of the writing process and this part of the story is often the hardest to write. And personally, I do agree. I often struggle with writing this middle third as well, finding it the part where the plot is often stretched the thinnest and momentum is quickly depleting. How often do we have an amazing hook or a great concept and even an awesome plan for where the story is going, but just struggle to carry it through to the end? Well, as a writer, an editor, and a writing coach, I've come up with a few concepts and tips to help write a better middle section of a story and also how to avoid having a soggy middle. Welcome back to the Wrestling with Words podcast. My name is Cameron. I'm a writer, an editor, and your host. Here, we talk about all things related to writing and storytelling, and the goal is to help you tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. Now, this is a broad and even oversimplified segment of your story, but we are talking about the second third of your writing project. We've moved past the hook and the intro, and now we are getting to that middle section. This is the real meat of the story. There's usually some kind of shift that happens as we leave the beginning of the story and enter into this next part. And this shift both happens on the page and in the story, but also subconsciously for the writer. The start of a new project and the exciting possibilities that come with a new draft often start to fade as we wade deeper and deeper into this story. And on the flip side, after we've come out of the deep waters of the middle portion of our work, we are often given a new burst of momentum that ends up carrying us through to the end of our story. And that's the first point that I really want to highlight: momentum. Beginnings can often grip us and the endings can often stay with us. But it's often this middle portion of your story where the momentum starts to falter, dragging down even the most promising of tales. And I know I said it earlier, but I should say that in the broadest sense, when I am referring to the middle of the story, I'm really referring to the second third of your story. I could give you a concrete percentage or an exact moment that it might appear in your story, but writing is dynamic, and I think that this would kind of belabor the point. For now, I think we all kind of know roughly what I am talking about. And when we talk about momentum, there are really two things that have momentum behind it: you as the writer and the trajectory of a story going from one plot beat to the next. Building momentum to finish our projects and building momentum that excites the audience are two different things that need to be managed. But when we speak about our momentum as the actual writers for this middle portion of the story, we should really ask ourselves a couple of questions while we are writing. Is this enjoyable to write? Is this an exciting part of the story? How does this build into the larger narrative? And where exactly are we going? And what new information is the audience receiving? And these are just kind of passive checks that we might run in the background to avoid having filler kind of pop up in this middle part of the story. But the real key concept of hooking an audience through this middle portion of the story is to recognize that what got them to this point is not what is going to take them to the end. In most instances, if there is tension and conflict, the middle will not feel nearly as soggy. Tension and conflict will build momentum, but there needs to be a transition from the start of your story to this middle section. There are always exceptions to this, but for the most part, there should be some sort of shift or change, whether that be in the characters or the plot, leading the audience to the next part of your story. On a meta level, this is reflecting the change that people expect to see in a story, but also it'll keep things exciting and fresh as we go from scene to scene and act to act. But there's really two different kinds of shifts that we can use: character shifts and plot shifts. Looking at the character shift, we can use example from the TV show Silo or the book that inspired it, Wool. In the second episode, Juliet is nominated as the sheriff and her goals evolve to encompass this new responsibility, expanding her character arc and the main conflict. Within the story, there's a broadening of the plot, but because Juliet is our main character, it really shifts the momentum and perspective because of her new role as the Silo's sheriff. Her goals and responsibilities have changed and grown because of this shift in character. But another really interesting example that I think we can look at is in District 9. In District 9, Vickis
My name is Vickis van der Merwe.
undergoes a profound transformation that shifts both his role in the story and the overall narrative focus. Initially, Vickis is a bureaucrat tasked with overseeing the forced relocation of the alien prawns. This establishes him as a passive enforcer of institutional oppression. However, after an incident exposes him to an alien biotechnology, Vickis begins to mutate into one of the beings he once sought to displace. This transformation redefines his arc, shifting him from a hunter to the hunted. It is both literal, as he becomes a physical hybrid, and thematic, as he experiences firsthand the oppression he once imposed on others. The story moves from a broader exploration of societal and governmental dynamics to an intimate focus on Vickis's personal metamorphosis and survival. The film's mockumentary style in the opening segment builds a sense of realism while contextualizing the societal conflict between humans and prawns. As the story progresses, the narrative shifts in tone and scale, zooming in on Vickis's internal and external struggles. This evolution keeps the audience engaged by transforming the plot into a deep personal tale of identity and redemption, while still reflecting the broader social commentary at the heart of the film. But those are primarily character shifts, the character triggering or becoming this sort of change in focus that redirects the plot and the direction of the story. On the other side, there can be a structural or plot shift that can occur as well to the same effect. The Third Day is a 6-part miniseries. A pivotal shift occurs between the first 2 episodes, collectively known as Summer, and the subsequent episodes, primarily Winter. The early chapters immerse the audience in the mystery, focusing on Sam's surreal and unsettling experience on OC Island. However, when the story transitions to Winter, the narrative changes not only in tone and pace, but also in perspective, providing a completely fresh point of view through the eyes of a new protagonist. This shift functions as a narrative reset, allowing the series to explore new dimensions of the central mystery, which initially engaged the audience. The shift also bridges the time gap, expanding the story's scope by introducing additional layers of conflict and deepening the mythology of OC. This change reinvigorates the plot, building momentum at the crucial point to keep the audience invested by revealing connections and contrasts between the 2 halves of the series. Another example of a plot shift can be seen in a series like Dune, where in the first book, the main plot shift occurs when Paul's father, the Duke, is killed. Leading up to this point, the Duke was sort of the main character of the story. But after he is killed around the middle portion of this story, Paul emerges as our new protagonist. In both these plot shifts, there are almost like 2 beginnings and 2 climaxes, offering a bit of a reset for the tension and refocusing the conflict. In some cases, we see structural shifts as well, with how we might introduce another point of view character or a flashback or introduce some element that wasn't initially revealed. In either case, we really want to recognize that the momentum at the start of a story and the hook is not necessarily going to be the momentum that brings us through the middle of our story. There should be some kind of shift for the character to experience, or some sort of plot shift that redefines or reintroduces some other bit of conflict to be solved.
One whole wall is one of these. And we've got it split up into 3 acts.
We have different colored markers just like here too, look at
Yep. Each individual scene has to work as a kind of funny sketch. You don't want one scene that's just like, well, what was the point of that scene? We've found out this really simple rule that maybe you guys have all heard before, but it took us a long time to learn it. We can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words "and then" belong between those beats, you're f***ed, basically. You got something pretty boring. What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word therefore or but, right? So what I'm saying is that you come up with an idea and it's like, okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No, it should be this happens and therefore this happens.
I saw this clip a long time ago and it really changed how I approached story beats. Like many points of advice, sometimes it is the simplest of things that have the most profound effect. But we really need to understand that what Parker and Stone were talking about is that they were emphasizing that events in a narrative should be connected by causality rather than mere chronology. Having just a couple of sequential events that happen and then happen and then happen is not interesting and can come across as being very flat. We really want to establish a cause and effect type of rhythm. We really want to have it that each plot beat and each decision that is made has some kind of weight and meaning behind it. This ensures that each event will propel the story forward, creating a creative and engaging plot. And kind of echoing back to our first point, doing this and creating clear causation in our story gives the story in and of itself momentum. This gives us momentum from one action and one event to the next. We also see this enhanced character development. Again, having the fact that we have the decisions matter and actually affect the plot builds the complexity of this character and their development. This gives a level of impact to every beat and plot moment. And the sort of last thing as to why this is such an important sort of concept and why, for me, it was such a revolutionary principle to sort of operate by is that it avoided predictability. Utilizing therefore and but introduces unpredictability, as outcomes are directly tied to characters' choices and unforeseen obstacles. This unpredictability keeps the middle of a story dynamic and engaging, avoiding the pitfalls of a predictable or soggy middle. Incorporating this concept and these techniques will take it so that the middle of your story stops from just being another point on the map, where we are going from beginning, middle, and end, but to something dynamic and interesting. This will really help you carry from scene to scene and plot point to plot point. It forces you, the writer, on what the consequences are of the actions that your characters have. You aren't just writing a handful of events that have no connection to one another. You're writing a story, and a story that has some kind of cause and effect. And if you've listened to me for a while, you know that I wholeheartedly believe that conflict and tension are the things that really drive a story and that keep stories interesting. But we do need to have a critical eye for if our conflict or the conflict that we have is being dragged out or is being solved too early.
Not quite my tempo.
More importantly, though, knowing when our story might be dragging a point of conflict out or resolving it too early really contextualizes the points that have already been made in this video. Using but and therefore, we can use it as a way to build momentum around story beats. And these can be further enhanced by knowing if you are dragging or rushing your conflict.
Were you rushing or were you dragging?
Too many resolutions, i.e. we are rushing, might work if you're able to string these together coherently using the but and therefore. Or maybe you do want to slow down your conflict and build out that tension for a massive crescendo of a climax. But either way, we need to be intentional with how we are solving and resolving this conflict. And we can resolve it too soon or not soon enough. When we might be resolving conflict too early, if you are going to have some bit of conflict resolved, you need to know or at least set up the next bit of conflict that will be more compelling or dire than the one prior. An example of this, we can look at the Fellowship of the Ring, where when Frodo reaches Rivendell, this could be seen as a natural endpoint, and in some ways, a lot of conflict and tension is resolved. But instead of ending the conflict there, Tolkien intensifies it by revealing that Frodo must take the ring to Mount Doom.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
Raising the stakes and adding complexity to the story. Once the conflict is resolved, introduce another that escalates the stakes or that might shift the focus. This is sort of like a baton being passed in a race. But sometimes our conflict might be dragging. There needs to be an honest look at this, and it needs to be considered, is it reasonable that the conflict has gone on for as long as it is? Dragging the conflict out, we should ask ourselves if the conflict or the challenges are actually interesting or if they are actually just creating tedious roadblocks. We should understand that repetitive arguments between characters and filler action doesn't really progress the plot. We can look at a good example of resolving conflict quickly, like the TV show The Bear. Every episode seems to resolve some kind of immediate issue that the restaurant or Carmi might face, or any of the other characters that might face. But the central idea is that when those episodic conflicts and points of tension are resolved, there's always something bigger looming in the horizon. Another example that dealt with a good balance of resolving conflict and dragging conflict out is in the video game Horizon Forbidden West. In this game, Aloy resolves the immediate crisis of rebuilding the override system early in the game. But this leads to a greater conflict, confronting the AI nemesis, Hades. The resolved problem reveals a more menacing threat, driving the story into its second act with renewed urgency. And speaking of creating more conflict and more interesting middle parts of your story, this almost comes at a perfect time for today's sponsor, Reedsy. But I've been taking Reedsy's 101-day writing course, and I'm happy to talk about it for you today. Reedsy's 101-day writing course is almost like enrolling in a college creative writing course. Every class comes with writing targets, challenges, takeaways, and further readings if you want to learn more about a subject. Right now, myself and this cohort has reached the midpoint of the class, but there has been some amazing lessons as well up until now. Tom Bromley is an excellent teacher, and Reedsy Learning's masterclass platform is perfect for working on your novel. It also has its own in-house outlining and tracking software that you can plan your story and even track your word count. If you're looking for a course to take that by the end of it, you will have completed a manuscript that you are proud of or want to expand on your storytelling prowess, consider joining Reedsy's 101-day writing course. Thank you, Reedsy, for sponsoring today's video.
Today, we're going to turn to some of the plot issues involved with writing the middle part and some of the ways to combat this. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment that you're putting up a tent. You've got one pole at one end of the tent and another at the opposite. When you put the canvas over it and step back to look at it, what do you notice? The tent is up and standing, but there's a dip in the middle. Now imagine that you've got a third pole, which you place in the middle of the tent, halfway between the other two poles. Rather than there being a dip there is now a lift in the centre. The sag in the middle has gone. You're probably ahead of me here, but today we're going to look at adding a middle pole into your plotting. Those two end tent poles represent the start and end of the novel. Without something in between them, it is likely that some sort of sagging will occur. That third pole changes the shape of the story. Just when the centre of your story is threatening to sag, it instead offers you a point to aim towards. That in the middle of the story, something happens or is found that changes the direction of the narrative. But what that discovery does is to propel the story forwards in a new and different direction. It doesn't mean that everything is resolved, but this is the moment when the start of that transformation begins.
And the midpoint is a crucial beat in the story. If you're looking for kind of a lightning rod to aim the tension and the conflict towards, it's the perfect thing to sort of plot and plan out. This is only an excerpt from the Reedsy's 101-day writing course, but I think it does a really good job at visualizing and creating a picture as to how important that midpoint can be and how it can help you in avoiding writing a soggy middle. The middle of a story is perfect for considering what the reader might be expecting or even anticipating, and then either expanding on those expectations or subverting them. Adding plot twists, character betrayals, and revelations can completely change and even enhance the direction that the story is going at this midsection. These elements add deep layers of intrigue, deepen relationships between characters, and can make the middle portion of your story just as interesting as the start and the end. Now, there are plenty of things you can do in the middle third of your story to fulfill promises or subvert expectations. But largely, every story has some of these elements in it. Betrayals, reveals, this being either a new character or the antagonist or some other plot element is revealed, and revelations. Usually, the middle of your story majors in at least two of these, while then minoring in the others. It's best to not try and make the main focus all three of these aspects, as they often then start to overcrowd the space and fight for attention. But let's look at a few examples of each of these so that you kind of understand what these might look like in a story. For betrayal, we can look at Shay's betrayal of Tyrion in A Song of Ice and Fire. This really shifts Tyrion's whole arc, adding depth to his character and reshaping his path in the story. This also leads to Tyrion going and killing his father. But we can also look at Red Rising. This is used all throughout the first book and the series. Betrayal and the factionization of the different gold families keeps the story interesting and tense. But we can also introduce new characters, and there's a couple different ways in which we can introduce new characters as well. Introducing someone from a main character's past or an entirely new figure can shake up the plot, either becoming a hindrance or being there to help the protagonist. We can ask if this new character is a boon, a burden, someone from the main character's past, something like this. In Severance, we can look at every character's inner self and outer self being these different points of introduction. But we can also have the true antagonist reveal themselves. This happened in Gone Girl, where Amy's true motives become clear, changing the story's direction and giving the audience a reason to stay invested through the middle. In sort of like a bonus one for this section as well, there's also the reunion and converging plot lines that can be really interesting and fresh. This usually occurs when two point of view characters meet for the first time. Usually this changes the course of the story because this moment is often a mini climax. After these characters meet for the first time, the momentum builds in a new direction. This happens a lot with epic fantasy and in space operas, as well as some thrillers and mysteries. But more often in thrillers and mysteries, we see this as different parallel timelines all converging at one central point. But we can also add revelations to the story as well. You can probably think of many revelations that have occurred in different narratives and stories, but one good example of this is in the movie The Menu. As the story progresses and we find out that Tyler knew that the guests were intended to die and still brought Margaret, this changes Margaret's role and the stakes, giving her a renewed determination to outwit the chef. And it's in these kinds of things where we can really start to manipulate the course of the story and get creative with the fresh and interesting directions that it might go. I often look at the middle section and even the midpoint as I'm outlining and think, what are the things that I can include to be red herrings so that the audience might not see this aspect coming? And also, what are the things that I can hide in plain sight? Or even the expectations that I can establish to either fulfill on or subvert? But that planning process is what leads us into the last point, that we should approach the middle section with a plan. Most often, I have found that when the soggy middle occurs is when there really isn't a plan or direction for this part of the story. When in doubt, we can look at the structure of our story and try to identify the parts that are slowing down and becoming a slog, or that are even sagging and having no tension or conflict. It's good to identify key moments and write those down, or write towards those. Sometimes it is good to think of parts of the middle of your story as the beginnings and ends of interconnected plot points. This can force you to have conflict and reflection and reactions to each of these different plot dynamics. Consider cutting out the subplots that are unnecessary, or try to find a way to tie those subplots into the main story. This is often easier said than done, but really consider the boring parts of your story. Every story has them, and it's more of just creating interesting, boring parts, if that's possible, or removing those entirely. Even if you jump around from the most interesting parts, then come back later to connect them together, that will keep the story at least moving. It's good to experiment and to not be too rigid in your plan for this middle part. We should have a critical eye and really look at our work with a level of scrutiny, knowing what parts are working and what parts might be a little bit of an indulgence on our behalf. But the worst thing you can do for writing the middle of your story and This goes beyond just writing a soggy middle, and that is to give up or not write it at all. It's so easy to stop halfway through a project or get stuck somewhere in the middle. Don't stop writing. Even if you've written a soggy or a slow middle, you can always go back and revise it later. Soggy middle or not, finish writing that story. But let me know what you think. Do you often struggle with writing this middle part of a story, or is writing the middle portion of your story easier than the beginning or maybe the end? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.